freeze every account my parents can touch. Every card, every signature authority, every property key. I want it done before the bank closes today. I set it into my phone from the top step of the Hartwell County Courthouse, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to be, which surprised me, because my hands were shaking so badly I had already dropped my car keys twice just getting out of the building. In my left hand, I held a manila envelope containing a certified copy of a court order, the clerk's stamp so fresh that the ink had smudged faintly under my thumb. Judge Okafor had denied my parents' petition for conservatorship over me, denied it with prejudice, which my attorney told me was the closest a probate judge ever comes to calling someone a liar out loud. Pinned to the lapel of my charcoal gray blazer was a small silver brooch shaped like a drafting compass. My grandmother had worn it every working day of her life, and I had put it on that morning specifically because it made me feel like the woman she had always believed I was, the one who could hold a straight line no matter who was shaking the table. The October light was going low and golden across the courthouse plaza, and somewhere behind me my parents were still inside the building with their lawyer, and I did not turn around to look. I lifted the phone back to my ear. "And call Rosalind Price," I said. "Tell her it's time to unseal everything." But I should back up, because none of this makes any sense without my grandmother. Marguerite Ashworth founded Ashworth Design Group in 1981 out of the back room of a failing print shop on Delancey Street, with a second-hand drafting table, a borrowed T-square, and a client list that consisted of exactly one dentist who needed a waiting room. Over the next 4 decades, she built that back room into one of the most respected architecture firms in the state, 42 employees, a portfolio that included 2 county libraries, a restored opera house, and half the skyline of our downtown. She was the one who raised me, in every way that mattered. My parents were busy people, socially ambitious people, and I spent my childhood summers at her elbow learning why a load-bearing wall is a promise and a facade is just a suggestion. On my 35th birthday, she signed over 35% ownership of the firm to me, slid the papers across her kitchen table like they were a slice of cake, and said the only blessing I ever needed to hear: "You're the only one in this family who ever loved the work more than the money." 4 years later, in March of 2019, she died in her sleep at 86, and her will left me the rest of it. The Ashworth estate, the house on Beacon Hill Road, 4 rental properties she had bought one at a time over 30 years, and a trust to maintain all of it, with her younger brother, my great-uncle Harold Ashworth, named as trustee because he was the only person alive she said could not be charmed, bullied, or bought. I grieved hard. I will not pretend I didn't. I took 8 weeks of leave from the firm, and I saw a grief counselor for exactly 6 sessions, and I cried in my car in a grocery store parking lot more than once. This is important because those 8 weeks and those 6 sessions became the raw material for everything my parents did next. My mother, Celestine, was born a Marchbank, and if you knew the Marchbanks, you knew that the surname traveled in packs. She had never once raised her voice in my presence in 40 years. She operated entirely in soft focus, in casseroles and concern, and in the weeks after Grandma's funeral the concern arrived at my door daily. "You've been through so much, darling," she would say, smoothing my hair like I was 9. "Let us carry some of the weight for a while. Family should look out for family." It sounded reasonable. Everything she ever said sounded reasonable for exactly 1 sentence. And I was tired, and I was sad, and the estate was suddenly mine and enormous. So when she suggested that she and my father, Ambrose, could handle the property paperwork, while I got back on my feet, I signed a limited power of attorney for property management and thanked them for it. My father patted my hand. My mother said, "The Marchbanks have always been good with buildings, sweetheart. It would be a shame not to use us." I actually remember feeling grateful. For almost 2 years, nothing looked wrong, because nothing was supposed to look wrong yet. The first thread came loose in the spring of 2021, and it was small. An invoice crossed my desk by accident, misdirected by a new bookkeeper, for a roof repair on the Chestnut Street rental. $18,400. I happened to know the tenant there, an elderly retired teacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, because Grandma had always hand-delivered her Christmas card, and when I called to ask how the new roof was holding up, there was a long pause before she said no one had touched that roof in 6 years. I told myself it was a clerical error. Paperwork gets crossed. I filed it in a drawer and I filed it in the back of my mind, and both drawers stayed shut for a while. The second thread was bigger. That autumn I learned, almost in passing, that the property management contract for all 4 rentals had been quietly moved away from Hollis and Grange, the firm my grandmother had used for 19 years, and reassigned to a company called Marchbank Property Solutions, LLC. I looked it up on the Secretary of State's website at 11 o'clock at night, sitting in my kitchen with the overhead light off and only the laptop glowing, and there it was, registered 11 months after my grandmother's death. Sole organizer, Celestine Marchbank. My mother had not mentioned it once. When I asked her about it at Sunday dinner, keeping my voice light, she smiled and refilled my wine and said, "Why should strangers profit from family property? Preston runs it beautifully." Preston Marchbank was her cousin. I had met him twice in my life, both times at funerals. The third thread should have required 3 signatures and had only 1. Trust disbursements for estate maintenance consulting were leaving the account at $6,500 a month, payable to Preston, and every authorization that should have carried my great-uncle Harold's co-signature as trustee carried only my father's, executed under the power of attorney I had signed at my lowest point. 3 layers of oversight my grandmother had deliberately built into that trust, bypassed on a single pen stroke. I found this by requesting the trust statements directly from the bank, in person, on my lunch hour, telling no one. And then there was the 4th thread, the one that still makes me laugh in a way that has no joy in it. Buried in 2 years of statements was a rolling restoration project, billed in careful, plausible increments totaling $240,000 for structural restoration of a carriage house on the Beacon Hill estate. Here is what you need to understand. There is no carriage house on the Beacon Hill estate. There was one, briefly, before my time. It was demolished in 1994. On the spot where it once stood, my grandmother had planted a vegetable garden, and the only structure occupying that sacred restoration site was a compost bin I had personally assembled from a kit. My parents had spent 2 years billing a dead woman's trust for the ongoing renovation of a building that existed only in an invoice template. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it is the part one regret. I went to my brother. Desmond is 3 years younger than me, and for most of our lives he was my closest ally, the person I called first. I laid it out for him carefully, the roof that was never repaired, the LLC in our mother's maiden name, the missing co-signatures, and he laughed. He actually laughed, warm and easy, and told me I was inventing conspiracies where there was only family helping family. "You've been under so much strain, Vic," he said. "You're seeing shadows." I let it go. 4 months later, after I found the carriage house billing, I tried once more, and this time there was no warmth at all. His voice went flat and cold, and he told me I was ungrateful, that Mom and Dad had held everything together while I fell apart, and that Grandma would be ashamed of my paranoia. I stood in my hallway holding the phone long after he hung up. I never raised the subject with him again. That was the night I stopped trying to be believed and started building the file that would make belief irrelevant. Around the same time, I began to understand that the money was only half the scheme. At a cousin's wedding that winter, my Aunt Ottilie, 2 glasses of champagne deep, squeezed my arm and told me how brave I was, how wonderful it was to see me doing so well after everything. I asked her, gently after everything what, and it came out in pieces, the way spilled water finds every crack. My mother had spent 2 years telling the extended family that I was mentally unstable. The 6 grief counseling sessions had become, in her telling, a psychiatric collapse. The 8 weeks of leave had become an inability to function. There was a story circulating that I had been found wandering a parking lot in my nightgown, confused, and another about medications I had supposedly refused to take. None of it had happened. All of it was load-bearing. Because you do not spread a story like that for entertainment. You spread it as foundation work, so that when you eventually walk into a courtroom and ask a judge to declare your own daughter incapable of managing her inheritance, a dozen relatives will already believe they watched it happen. So I got quiet, and I got professional. Through my attorney, I hired a forensic accountant named Rosalind Price, a precise, unhurried woman who had spent 20 years untangling exactly this kind of family arithmetic. I paid her in cash. We met twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, at a coffee shop in Brayford, 40 minutes from home, chosen because no one I had ever met in my life would be there. I brought her bank statements in a gym bag. She brought me questions in a leather folio and never once wrote my name on anything. It took her 11 months to untangle it all, 11 months of shell entities and rerouted rents and phantom consulting, and when the report was finally complete, 312 pages with an executive summary that read like an autopsy, I did not confront anyone. I put it in a locked drawer in my office at the firm, and I waited. Our state is a one-party consent state, which meant that every phone call with my mother for the past year, every soft-focus inquiry about my health, every gentle suggestion that I seemed tired, seemed fragile, seemed not quite myself, existed as a dated audio file in 3 separate locations. I documented everything and demanded nothing. I let them believe the ground was still soft. Some people would call that cold. I call it clarity. They filed in September a petition for conservatorship over my person and my estate, on the grounds that I was mentally incapable of managing my affairs, supported by affidavits from 4 Marchbank relatives and my brother. My mother called me the evening the papers were served, and her voice was pure velvet. She said they were doing this because they loved me. She said, "This isn't against you, darling. It's for you." I thanked her for calling. Then I drove to my attorney's office with the gym bag and the locked drawer's contents and the audio files, and we prepared for the only conversation that was ever going to matter, the one that happens under oath on the record, with a microphone catching every word. The hearing lasted a day and a half, and every minute of it was recorded, which is the detail my parents somehow never metabolized. Their lawyer went first, and he painted the portrait they had spent 2 years commissioning, a fragile woman, undone by grief, wandering parking lots, refusing help. The court-ordered psychological evaluation came back before lunch, and the evaluator, a doctor with 30 years of experience, described me as, and I am quoting the transcript, among the most organized and lucid subjects I have assessed in my career. That alone dented the story. What broke it was the audio. My attorney entered the recordings one at a time. The room got very still during the call from the previous March, the one where my mother, believing she was speaking privately to Aunt Ottilie, coached her through her affidavit line by line, and then said the sentence that will follow her for the rest of her life. It doesn't matter whether she's actually unwell. What matters is the judge believing she can't manage it. I watched my mother's lawyer close his eyes for slightly too long. I watched my father study his hands. Judge Okafor listened to all of it without expression, and then she denied the petition with prejudice, stated on the record that the testimony offered in support was, in her words, coordinated and lacking credibility, and noted, in the careful language judges use when they are placing a loaded object on a shelf where everyone can see it, that the financial exhibits raise questions well outside the scope of her courtroom. Which brings us back to the courthouse steps, the manila envelope, the smudged stamp, my grandmother's compass brooch catching the late light, and my shaking hands dialing the bank. Because the conservatorship petition had done the one thing my parents should never have allowed. It had ended any obligation I had to protect them. Within 20 minutes of my call, the bank had suspended every authority my parents held under that power of attorney, which my attorney had already moved to revoke, and flagged every account tied to the trust. Within 2 hours, a locksmith was rotating the cylinders at the estate office and all 4 rental properties, while a courier hand-delivered termination notices to Marchbank Property Solutions, LLC. By 4:45 that afternoon, Rosalind Price's full report was in the hands of Harold's attorney, and my great-uncle, 78 years old and constitutionally incapable of being charmed, bullied, or bought, had read the 12-page executive summary twice, set it down on his desk, and begun making calls of his own in the flat, unhurried voice of a man measuring lumber. Before the workday ended, Preston Marchbank had been formally removed from every engagement touching the estate, and the trust's new accountants were in the building. It took one afternoon to undo what they had spent 5 years constructing. It always does in the end. The building goes up slowly and comes down all at once. My mother came to my house that night. It was 9:40 on a Tuesday, and she did not ring the bell. She pounded on the door with the flat of her hand, hard enough that across the street the Hendersons' porch light flicked on, and she was shouting before I had the door fully open, shouting in a voice I had never heard from her in 40 years, about ingratitude and betrayal and everything she had sacrificed. Her face contorted into something I did not recognize. This woman, who had never once raised her voice in 4 decades of pleasantries. I stood in the doorway in my grandmother's blazer, the compass brooch, still pinned to the lapel because I had not yet been able to make myself take it off, and I let her run out of air. I said, "The accounts are frozen. The report is with Harold. Those are the facts." And then she changed, and the change took less than 30 seconds. The fury drained out of her face like water finding a level, and her voice went soft and warm and wounded, and she reached toward me with both hands and spoke about love, about family, about how this had all been a terrible misunderstanding between people who adored each other. "This can all be undone, darling," she said. "Families forgive." I almost admire the audacity of it. 2 years of engineered rumors, $250,000 built to a compost bin, a courtroom attempt to legally erase me, and she was offering me forgiveness. And then, for one instant, something flickered underneath the performance, a small involuntary shift around her eyes, a hairline crack, and I understood that she had finally grasped that I was not bluffing, that the daughter she had spent years describing as fragile had spent those same years building a case with the patience of a woman who drafts foundations for a living. The flicker passed. The threats began. Lawyers. Connections. People she knew. "This is not over," she said. I said, "The report is 312 pages. Your name is in most of them." Then I closed the door, quietly, the latch catching with a small, clean click, and I turned off the porch light, and I stood in my dark hallway and breathed until my heart slowed down. What came after was not magic. It was work, and I want to be honest about that too, because the movie skipped this part. The estate's affairs were a 5-year excavation site, and I hired a steady, sharp-eyed operations manager named Thaddeus Cray to help me dig it out, a former construction auditor with a habit of reading contracts the way other people read crime novels. We rebid every vendor agreement the Marchbanks had touched. We instituted a rule that no disbursement over $1,000 moved on fewer than 2 signatures. We inspected all 4 rental properties top to bottom and personally apologized to Mrs. Okonkwo, whose roof we actually repaired. The numbers told the story better than I ever could. In the first 90 days under legitimate management, estate maintenance costs dropped by 26%, almost overnight, because we were suddenly paying only for work that existed. Rosalind's final reconciliation put the total siphoned across 5 years at $611,000 between the Phantom Carriage House, the consulting fees, the inflated repairs, and rents that had been quietly rerouted through the LLC. And the following spring, the trust posted its strongest annual return since my grandmother's death. She was right. Adjectives lie. Numbers don't. My parents' lawsuit, the one my mother promised on my doorstep, arrived as a threat letter and died as a whisper. During pre-litigation discovery, their own attorney was obligated to review Rosalind's report, and whatever he saw in those 312 pages, he apparently advised them, quietly and urgently, that proceeding would invite a criminal referral for fraud, because the letters simply stopped coming. No trial, no headlines, just silence, spreading outward like frost. Preston Marchbank left the state within 3 months, his forwarding address a P.O. box 2 time zones away. The bookkeeper who had processed the carriage house invoices, a nervous, meticulous woman named Odette Fairweather, resigned by email at 6 o'clock one morning and never came back for her last check. Marchbank Property Solutions, LLC, was dissolved that winter, presumably to bury the paper trail, its registration simply winking out of the state database like a light going off in a distant window. My parents sold their house the following summer and moved 2 states away, and the extended family, the same relatives who had signed affidavits about my instability, did not throw them a farewell party. Nobody defends a scheme once it stops paying. Harold and I discussed pressing criminal charges exactly once. In his study, over tea neither of us drank. He is not a sentimental man, and his reasoning was 1 sentence long. "Watching them lose everything they built on stolen ground is punishment enough," he said, and went back to his newspaper. "I will admit something here, because this story is worthless if I lie in it. Part of me wanted more. Part of me wanted the referral, the case number, the reckoning with their names spelled correctly in public record. That part of me still visits sometimes, late at night. I let the decision stand anyway. Grandma built things. The Marchbanks built for things that were not there. I know which side of that line I live on. Desmond called me once, the following spring, on a Sunday afternoon while I was repotting herbs from the Beacon Hill garden. He did not defend anyone. He did not explain, or excuse, or ask for anything. He asked how I was doing, and he listened to the answer, and for about 4 minutes the brother I grew up with peeked through the version of him our mother had spent a decade constructing. Then he said he was glad, and he said goodbye, and he never called again. I have made my peace with that, mostly. Some doors you close, some just swing slowly in the weather, and you learn to stop watching them. Last October, a year to the week after the hearing, the partners of Ashworth Design Group gathered the whole firm at the old print shop on Delancey Street, which my grandmother had bought back decades ago and kept as our archive, her first drafting table still standing in the corner under the window where the light comes in slantwise. In front of 42 employees, Harold and the board named me managing principal, and he placed in my hand the original brass key to the Delancey Street door, worn smooth by 40 years of her thumb. I was wearing the charcoal gray blazer, and pinned to the lapel was the silver drafting compass, the same one I had worn on the courthouse steps and in my doorway at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, the one I had put on all those mornings specifically because it made me feel like the woman my grandmother always saw when she looked at me. Standing on that worn floor where a firm was once drawn out of nothing, holding that key, I understood that the thing my parents had tried to take was never really the money. It was the right to be believed as myself, and for the first time in years, my life truly belonged to me. Some people would call what I did mercy. I call it finished. If a story like this happened in your family, I want to hear how you would have handled it. So tell me in the comments, and if you believe patience beats panic every single time, subscribe, because there are more true justice stories where this one came from.